Morning, everybody. Thank you very much. It's not my first time in Engelberg. Actually, this is my third time, so I'm quite happy that I have the opportunity to talk to you again. But I think it's also quite a...
Could you please slow your talk so that we can better understand?
Okay. Okay, thanks. I tend to speak fast, so I'll try to be a bit slow. I was saying it's also quite an uphill task to be a discussant for Professor Welter's paper because he deals with quite a complex situation and using a very complex methodology to reconstruct some of the evidence that we can use to understand what makes perhaps people who would be normal under normal circumstances decide to commit mass murder and mass killings. So when I got Professor Welter's paper, which was just about 2 days ago, I read through it and I thought how to respond to this. And I thought maybe it might be good for me to make reference to contemporary equivalents or contemporary equivalents of mass murders and mass killings, particularly from Africa, Southern Africa, and East Africa, and try to draw some parallels from these. So one of the first things that struck me was Professor Welter put a lot of emphasis on morality, which is good. In his paper, he actually asserts that what allows normal people to participate in mass killing and mass murders and don't feel something bad about it, is because there are conditions that create moral frameworks that justify their activities and participation in mass murders. And I was thinking to what I think most of us would know, what happened in South Africa just about the same time in 1948 when the Afrikaner government in South Africa decreed apartheid as a legal policy in Africa, which was really based on differentiation of others in the sense that the Afrikaners were considered in South Africa as superior group or superior race. Indians and Coloureds were kind of somewhere in the middle. And black Africans were really at the bottom, so sort of the most inferior race. And why I'm bringing this is I say that beyond the moral codes or beyond the moral framework that we see, particularly in the Holocaust example, I think for me, in the case of South Africa, what was very strong was the legal mechanism, the laws that were created. So whereas moral framework would allow you to judge whether what you're doing as an individual or as a group is bad or good, I think a legal framework allows you to differentiate whether what you're doing is legal or illegal. And I think the differences between this is that often we know that if we violate the law, if we're doing something that is legal, we expect that the people are going to have recourse to the law, and therefore punishment might come, which might not be the case in a situation where you are basing your actions just based on morality. There were actually hundreds of statutes and laws in South Africa that allowed people, and in this sense I'm really talking about members of the government, armed forces, members of the police. If I might just mention one example, I think on March 21st, 1960, when black South Africans decided that they were going to have, in different parts of the country, peaceful rallies to protest against apartheid. In now the famous place called Sharpeville, where South African armed forces went and shot and killed many people at the same time. My take on this is that I cannot state for fact whether some of them knew whether what they were doing was morally good or wrong. But I know that they probably did this because they knew that they were on the right side of the law. So my point about this, to summarize, is just that the law is very important. And I think Professor Welter would be able to sort of, maybe in our discussions also, tell us a little bit about the legal structure that allowed the kind of mass killings that happened in Germany in this context. The second thing that I want to draw from this is that the question we're discussing today is really saying that you have a group of normal people living normally in a normal context, and within a few days or perhaps a few weeks, they turn into mass murderers and mass killers. I'm not extremely familiar with the Holocaust Project as well to be able to make conclusive comments about this. But from what's happening in Africa, I think this is one of the perceptions that has created what I call a false image of mass murders and mass violence. Often, there are very strong historical dimensions to what leads to normal people to commit murder and commit mass killings. And sometimes, in some situations, what you just need is something to trigger, as you say, a change in circumstances, in society circumstances, but also sometimes it's just a trigger that happens. So this is, I think we all know about 1994 Rwanda. Within a period of just about 90 days, we had extremists of Hutu ethnic background killing Tutsis and moderate Hutus, just about close to 1 million people within about 90 days. That's a typical example of what you'll be talking about. But I think just coming in and looking at this from a fact that, within a short space of time, you have people who are normal, people who are perhaps even members of the same family, members of the same community, members of the same church, decide to turn on each other without looking at the underlying historical factors, in a sense, would be a mistake. So this photo shows the Independence Day of Rwanda in 1961. You can see kids very happy, smiling. I mean, I would imagine being there that they're looking forward to a very prosperous future. The colonizers are gone. We have the chance to run our country. We have a chance to be follow a self-determination path. But then in most, for example, what happened in most African countries, including Sudan and so on, is that the process of trying to create states out of many nations was done in such a way that certain groups or certain ethnic groups were elevated against the others, given more opportunities, given more privileges, given more access to education, more access to resources. And what happened is that we really, instead of having independence as it were here, we had cases where now we had certain section or ethnic groups really taking over the dominance and continuing on with perpetrating injustice against other groups. So in this sense of Rwanda, I think what happened is that the Tutsis dominated the governance of the country, often over a period of about 45 years. By the time the Rwanda genocide happened, there was a systematic feeling of injustice that had developed over time amongst the Hutus. And it just needed the fact that the president of Rwanda was, killed in a plane, bombed on a plane in 1994, and combined with other factors, including the role of the media, it gave everybody the opportunity to start killing even members of their own family. So my contention, and I think Professor Welter will probably come to this when we are discussing, is that was there certain historical factors that created a condition for the Nazis perhaps participating in the Holocaust to be able to make ordinary Germans or members of, feel that, we are not just superior, but we might be threatened by other factors. And I think with that, also looking into what was the role of World War I and the outcomes of World War I in terms of Germans' participation, and eventually what we saw later on in the Nazi project. So this is just to illustrate what was happening. 1961, you get independence. 1994, now most of the perhaps kids that you see in these schools are probably now out of their countries as refugees. And I might just clarify that I'm actually talking in the context of making a lot of references to state actions and to countries where there's social order based on a state governance, not really countries where you don't have, where there's civil disorder and the state structures are broken down. So both Rwanda and South Africa had very strong state structures with proper governance systems, and maybe not fair, but proper. Another case that I was thinking about when I was reading your paper is the very changing conditions that we see in the world. We do have cases, particularly in Africa, where the states don't have to create the laws that would allow state functionaries to participate in mass murder. But what they would do is to participate in mass murders through what we call proxies. Now, as we are talking right now, we know what's happening in Darfur in Sudan. Of course, it's hard to get direct evidence, but one of the groups that has been very instrumental in committing mass murders are the Janjaweed group in Sudan, in Darfur. And of course, for all practical purposes, the Janjaweed militia is a state-sponsored sort of what you'd call a state-sponsored terrorist group. And I think this is really moving into an arena where we are not really talking about just a moral framework or a legal framework. We're really talking about a situation where there's a stable state, but the same stable state is able to commit mass atrocities, mass murders, but through proxies as a way to protect maybe the key perpetrators. So I'm sure this is an ongoing debate. Right now we know the president of Sudan, for example, has been indicted, and that for him to be indicted by the International Criminal Court, I suppose there must be very strong evidence to suggest that he's directly or indirectly participating in this. And just to step aside from the example of Sudan and also look at situations where you have mass murders committed by civilians against civilians, I would just point out the case of Sierra Leone. This brings me to the discussion that we had over the couple of days, whether violence is more a form that is exhibited by youth more than adults and so on and so forth. But I was looking at what was happening in Sierra Leone, where the majority of the mass murders were young people below the age of, most cases below the age of 24. There was no constructed other in Sierra Leone. I mean, most of these young people were conscripted by force by the rebel groups, and they were convinced through an ideological process that allowed them to go and kill their parents. They would kill their parents, you'd kill your sisters, you'd kill members of your family. These members of your family are not from different tribes, they're not in a different social class, they're not from a different religion. So as you talk about the constructed other, I think in your paper really distinguishing what separates us from them, mainly looking at social class, for example, looking at race, for example, looking at religion, for example. Would we also look at this situation where we do have young people, youth mostly? We wouldn't consider them adults, so by standards of judgment, I don't think we could judge them by the same standards that we judge adults. But then they're able to, within a very short period of time, turn against even the most people that they should be trusting most. When you kill your mother and your father, it means you can kill yourself. That's how far you've gone. So I think that would also be a good point of discussion. Maybe my last point really would be to look, this is linked to the historical process, but to also look at where all this ends. I think that's also something that we've not discussed, but I think it's also very important, because if there are certain issues that lead to people committing mass murders and they're not addressed conclusively, the likelihood that it would reoccur can happen. And of course, this is something that we'll come to. And still going back to the case of South Africa and Rwanda here, what mechanisms do we put in place to ensure that we do not just carry out justice for the victims, but also allow perpetrators to come to terms with what they did? Because I think if you look at what happened, South Africa established the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. And I was reminded yesterday when we were talking about empathy, when you had some of the perpetrators coming to testify before the TRJC, the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, you would actually see that some of them were very remorseful, some of them were repenting, some of them were actually regretting their actions. So whereas at the time they were committing this crime, they could have been supported by a moral framework that justified their action as well as a legal framework. But human beings tend to change with circumstances, and human beings tend to learn from their actions. But given a forum like the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, which allows them to be able to come to terms with what they're doing in the context of what is right or what is wrong, as judged by international standards, for example, I think that's one powerful way for us to be able to bring in victims and perpetrators together and allow for forgiveness and empathy in a process that does not victimize either side. And then, so what is important when you talk about three levels at which you have to analyze this thing, whether, society level, group level, and personal level, I think when you look at what happens in, for example, Truth, Justice, Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and in Rwanda, they have, of course, we have the International Criminal Tribunal Court for the Rwanda, but we also have a localized system called the Gashasha courts, where perpetrators of violence are brought in to the local community. They actually confess what they did, and through that, the community decides what the level of punishment commensurate with their crime is. But what for me was important is that human beings have conscience. So when you go back to individual level, in your paper you talk about the fact that we cannot differentiate, we cannot make a uniform judgment that, somebody is either Nazi or not a Nazi, a German or not a German. We can't draw that line properly. And of course there are people who are Germans who really did not support the Holocaust. In South Africa there are people who are actually hardcore members of the of Afrikaner in a think tanks that really developed the ideology group who later on turned and said, this is wrong. And I think for me, what is important is to look at the conscience of those people. When it comes to individual level, it's really the conscience. I think when the circumstances does not allow your conscience to be expressed, as in when you're committing the murder, that's a different situation, because you would see people in the Truth and Justice Reconciliation Commission testifying and really drawing on their conscience and saying this was really wrong. So I think irrespective of what time their conscience takes the center stage, I think what is important is that you're allowed to come back to your conscience and say that, I was doing this, it was peer pressure, it was because of fear that maybe I would be killed, like the moderate Hutus in Rwanda were being killed if they defended themselves, and then allow that conscience to take root. So as I said, this is really a complex topic. I've been happy to look through this paper. I've learned quite a lot. One final conclusion that I would like to actually bring up for discussions in this forum was just one of the sentences in your paper, where you suggest that, actually this is what you write: if we attempt to explain the behavior of perpetrators of extermination, we are faced with the problem that we are utilizing a moral framework to judge them that was not in force when they committed their crimes. I had a slightly different view when I read this statement. I think there are certain things that we have to recognize. One of them is that if we recognize the universalism of human beings, of humanity, I don't think we are bound by time and space. I think if you do, as a human being, perhaps lived in America during the slavery, and violence was committed against you, versus somebody who's living right now in modern day Sudan, I don't think this. If humanism is universal, I think we should use the best framework that we have to judge, irrespective of the time. And I think, of course, what happened in Germany contributed a lot to the eventual adoption of the Declaration of Human Rights, which I think is a very good framework. But I think to say that we will reserve judgment based on differences in time and historical periods might be a dangerous route to take, and I might disagree with that. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we ran over the scheduled time far. But the questions raised here are so heavy, so important, I didn't want to interrupt any one of these speakers. And I'm particularly grateful to you, Mr. Osano, that you enlarged our view to the African continent and to these manifold African, terrible African experiences, of course. And you raised the question of truth and reconciliation after such events. And also you raised the important question of conscience. And I would like, of course, Professor Welser to respond, to give first his reflections on Mr. Osano's contribution.
Yeah, thank you very much for this brilliant comment. And I just want to mention 2 or 3 aspects, not to reject it, but just to follow up a little bit. I think the first question was concerning the legal conditions. And I think this is a really crucial point, because if you take the case of Darfur, for example, and Sudan, we have the situation of what we would call a failed state in terms of political science, which means there is not an established functioning structure of legal institutions, of conflict regulations and things like that. And as soon as conflicts pop up there in states like this, they have the tendency to unfold themselves in a very dynamic way. And different actors appear on the field, like the Janjaweed or paramilitary groups, warlords, things like that. So in the case of Germany, the development of the normative structure of National Socialist Germany, this was of course also the case, that this was in no way ein Rechtsstaat, a state that would follow established norms of legitimation and things like that, but was opening space for following stereotypes, prejudices, things that have been already there. And what is achieved by rechtsstaatliche Prinzipien is that we have modes and means of blocking these things that people want to do anyway. I think social reality is always full of prejudices, stereotypes, hate, whatever, because this is necessary. Groups differ each other from each other, and this is inevitable. I don't have the idea as a social psychologist that we would have something like a world society where everybody likes each other. If this is the case, nobody would have an identity anymore. Sorry for being so pessimistic, but this is something basic psychologically. But the problem is, as soon as on the governmental level norms are weakened or harmed or whatever, you open any kind of field for violent processes and things like that. And this is the case in the cases you discussed here. The second thing is, and I think this is really important, if you talk about ethnization, I think if we interpret the killings in Rwanda or in Darfur, we always, or also in ex-Yugoslavia, we always have the aspects that people would interpret the conflict as an ethnic conflict. But in most of the cases, the origin, the cause of the beginning cause of the conflict is something totally different, like overpopulation, loss of land, whatever, all kinds of things. But then people fight. The violence starts and people fight against each other. And then they are addressed as members of Hutu or Tutsi, and we hated these people all the time anyway, and there's these huge traditions and whatever. You find the same process of division amongst Croats and Serbs and things like that. But this goes to the role that violence plays in itself in structuring realities and perceptions, because violence is a very strong processual means to establish new realities. And this new reality is then the basis of what people decide again and again. This is something. So the dynamics of violence go then to make this kind of group definitions and things like that. And the third point is the question of reconciliation and things like that. And I understand the attempts in Rwanda and South Africa perfectly to do something, to bring victims and perpetrators together and things like that. But empirically spoken, I doubt that this will work really good, because we know from the Rwandan case that many Hutus still think the task is not fulfilled, the mission is not accomplished, although they meet each other and discuss these things, but the concept is still there, as it was, by the way, in the early post-war Germany. And as we know from other genocidal processes, normally it takes one generation that people that societies can come to terms with it, that they can start a coping process, that they confront themselves with what happened. The immediate perpetrator generation and also the immediate victims generation can't go into this process really very effective and successful. This is also not a very positive thing to say this, but I think it's the case. We know we always need like 30 years. As an individual psychology, it is sometimes very much better and takes a long time if people are traumatized to just keep silent, to not tip on it, but just, start to do other things, rebuild their normal way of life, in a societal case, rebuild the societies, things like that. It might be not so good to go immediately into the wounds, But thank you very much. It was really good.
Now I have questions from the audience. Professor Roth.
Yeah, Harald Welzer, the big question is now, how can we put together what you were telling us now about the normal 95%, and I was talking about yesterday about the 5%. And I think this is not too difficult, because if we develop what I call a protection and release theory of aggression and violence, it's very typical that those people you were talking about are normal under normal circumstances.
Right.
And they do not behave as if 5% I was talking about. Why? They have a shield against sudden violence and crime, which is constructed by early attachment experience and by education, by moral, by laws, by any kind of threatening punishment and so on. But this shield can be broken under extraordinary circumstances if the organization presses the right button, especially gives them the right legitimation for being violent. Then suddenly, or with a delay of certain days you are explaining, people do incredible things. And I think, together with Professor Spillmann, they just release what is in them, but heavily protected. I think it's not just from scratch. It's in us, but it's heavily protected and can be released by extraordinary means you were mentioning. A long list of how you can release this innate or early acquired, for example, by negative childhood experience. This is in addition to inborn or whatever aggressive. However, these other three groups, the instrumental criminals, they never developed this shield because they learned that aggressive behavior is beneficial. If you grew up in Bogota, you do not learn how to behave normally. You learn you have to be aggressive, otherwise you are dead. The second is, if the impulsive, reactive person has a very thin shield, and if they feel enormously threatened, they will be violent. In the third case of psychopath, there is no shield. Again, for psychological and biological, neurobiological reasons, they do spontaneously criminal things. So there is a complete continuum between normal and abnormal acts of violence. It's a question how thick the shield is, and we call normal those people who have, for neurobiological and for psychological and sociological reason, a big shield, and the others don't have them. This would be a way how to explain those things you're reporting and I was reporting, and that this is continuum, not a 95% good people and 5% evil people. This is not the case. I hope you could accept this.
Would you like to comment on it? Yes, I'll come back to you. First, let's have Professor.
Let him comment. I don't have, I would be interested.
Who was this?
Thank
okay.
you. Yeah. So I would like to comment on this comment, and I'm not so sure whether there is really this continuum. So somehow during these last 2 days now at this conference, I had somehow the impression that there is this broad variety of violent behavior. And I'm not sure whether actually maybe language is playing a trick on us. Maybe the word violence somehow suggests that there is something, like that there is a characteristic that is common to all violent situations. But actually maybe there are different phenomena that follow different social mechanisms or psychological mechanisms, different dynamics. So maybe there are actually different distinct phenomena and we need different models to explain them. So mass murder and hooligans, these are two different things. I mean, we need different explanations.
Yeah, but this wouldn't do much against Gerhard Roth's argument, I think. As soon as you take in respect that if violence is performed, something is going to happen. Violence changes the realities and changes the self-feeling and concept of the people who do it in some way. So I'm not sure how to operationalize this approach. I would say, I mean, from a historical point of view, we would also say, of course, these situations that I briefly described opens up opportunity structures for all kinds of persons. They open up the opportunity structure for the 5% type. Yeah, they have a great time during genocides. Although the SS or the commanders and so don't like what they do, so they are blocked most of the times. But anyway, so there are opportunity structures opened, and there are also opportunity structures open for people who had fantasies of violence or people who like to have power that they didn't have before, things like that. If we bring these kind of social circumstances and personal dispositions, or what I like more to speak about potentials, even in the case of the 95%. I mean, we have a lot of potentials to do very different things, and we do it every day. We do very different things every day, depending on what kind of interaction, what kind of situation we face. So the variety is very big. And then if we take these historical social circumstances and look what kind of opportunities are opened to let this or that potential unfold, we have something like a concept. And I agree that we could integrate these aspects. Yeah? But the puzzling thing is that for this type of violence that I described, we don't need much psychology, and also we don't need much neuropsychology. This is the point. But maybe if I add some other aspect where disciplines can be brought together. I work in this field since 20 years or something, and the problem is that there's always the attempt to draw conclusions in terms of political education or pedagogy and things like that. And there's always this term of Zivilcourage and make people behave zivilcouragiert and things like that, learning these examples. And the attempt is to apply something like a universal concept of morality to the kids, that they would act under every circumstance following a universal morality. And I think this is absolutely misleading, because if we take the aspect seriously, that these are divided labor processes, that these are divided responsibility that people have, we should teach children and pupils to use their room to maneuver in an adequate and optimal way, not saving the world, not be totally good and things like that, because this universalized concepts of morality won't work. It's too much for the people. It's much more efficient to teach them to do different things or autonomous things in the immediate space of maneuver they have. I think this is much more important. And then we can also bring this developmental psychology and neuropsychology and things and what I do together under this aspect.
Thank you very much. I'm reminded of the watch running, and I would hate to be guilty of taking away the time of our young people which are intent on presenting their projects after a short coffee break. Therefore, I apologize that I haven't given you the floor up here, but your contributions were so impressive. Let me thank all the participants of this morning, those who made presentations and those who made comments. And also, I would like to thank you for your attention. We are now going to take a coffee break, slightly shortened, and Mr. Galliker will remind us at the end when the coffee break nears its end, and we have to return to the audience. Thank you very much. And now,